So good morning, everyone. Many thanks for joining us for the launch of Safe Haven, a report, the first report published by Transparency International Ireland on how Ireland is prepared to stop the flow of the world's dirty money into both our financial services sector and non-financial services sector, and what it can do to repatriate the proceeds of international corruption to victim countries. I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts, including the two co-authors on this report, Dr. Colin King and Alexander Chance, as well as my colleague from Transparency International European Union Office, Laure Brillaud, who I'll just briefly introduce in a moment. Alex is a final year PhD candidate at the School of Ecumenics at Trinity College Dublin in Peace Studies. His research is exploring the intersection of organised crime and governance, and he has a professional background in reconciliation, diplomacy, and criminal justice cooperation in a variety of international contexts. Dr. Colin King is Reader in Law and Director of Postgraduate Research Studies at the School of Advanced Studies, University of London, where his research primarily focuses on the processes of crime and anti-money laundering law and practice. He's published widely in these areas, including negotiated justice and corporate crime, the legitimacy of civil recovery and deferred prosecution agreements. And Laure is a Senior Policy Officer, as I said, at TIEU, and leads its work on anti-money laundering. Her priority areas include beneficial ownership, transparency, the role of intermediaries in anti-money laundering, which we will shorten for convenience sake to AML supervision, golden visa market regulations, and asset recovery. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm John Devitt, Chief Executive of TI Ireland, and I edited and co-researched much of the report. So I'll talk to you for the next 20 minutes or so. I'm sorry, I should have posted the slides, which will help me talk you through the report itself. I can remember how I was supposed to share a screen. I've been doing this for a year now, and you think I was still a novice. So here we go. And yes, so before I get into it, just to remind people that this session is recorded. It's going out, I think, on Facebook Live and YouTube. And if anyone is saying anything, please, and there will be an opportunity for discussion after presentations, please take note of Ireland's draconian defamation laws. I'll do my best to, and avoid, where you can, citing examples that are not already confirmed and in the public domain. You never know who's watching or will be watching back. So after I introduce you to after I report itself, we'll turn to Alex, Colin, and Laure for a discussion, and then open it up for discussion and Q&A. So the report itself is broken down into 5 main sections. It is a coincidence that they all start with or the letter or. It was unintentional, I think. But we start by looking at the risk or risks associated with or the risk of money laundering, particularly the laundering of the proceeds of international corruption through Ireland's financial services and non-financial services sectors. We look at the response, the institutional and legal response to this risk by the Irish authorities. And then look back on some of the perspectives of practitioners, people working in this space, both in public office and in the private sector. Colin interviewed a number of practitioners. I should note that this report has been something of a labor of love. It's taken us about 3 years to get to this point. We've been working in fits and starts, and I'm delighted that we're able to present the first report, which we would like to update periodically, I should add, to monitor Ireland's progress in tackling this problem. But it has taken some time, and the interviews were conducted in 2017, 2018, but we've updated the report to take account of more recent developments, although we are aware that there may be some developments that we might have missed. And in the Q&A, we're more than happy to discuss those too. Finally, we'll look at what happens when the corrupt assets are identified, seized, and a decision has to be taken on what happens to those assets. And then we'll briefly just touch on some of the recommendations arising from the report. So we set out or lay out the context for the research that we've conducted on measures aimed at tackling money laundering and the laundering of corrupt assets. And as you probably know already, and for those who joined us, joined our last presentation and webinar, Ireland is considered to be one of the least corrupt countries in the world, according to the Corruption Perceptions Index and the numerous surveys which are conducted and used in the index itself. However, it's a relatively strong institutions, political stability, and the incentives, economic and commercial incentives created for investment and to attract financial services into Ireland also pose a risk that Ireland will be used by people in, particularly public officials, to launder, corrupt public officials to launder the proceeds of bribery and embezzlement. And it's worth noting that Ireland is a leading, Dublin itself is a leading financial services sector. It has 2.8 trillion euros in net assets and funds domiciled here. It is home to or host to the world's top 50 banks and has 40% of the servicing 40% of the global of the world's hedge funds. So we touch on a number of cases which highlight this risk, including that of, sorry, the tagline there is wrong, of Judamas Sirawan, who is the former governor of Bangkok's International Film Festival, who was jailed for 50 years for her part in, or for soliciting bribes from US business people for sponsorships at the film festival, and she received, or was convicted of, as I said, receiving 1.8 million US dollars. And in 2014, The Criminal Assets Bureau sought a proceeds of crime order to freeze €250,000 in proceeds which had been invested in funds managed by HSBC Life Insurance Company. In addition, in 2015, the 6 million euros worth of investment bond funds were frozen in an account again managed by HSBC Life. And these were the proceeds, believed to be the proceeds of corruption, which had been, or the victims of these were a small portion of the 2 billion euros worth of funds embezzled by Aviation and the proceeds of bribes over a 4-year period from 1994 to 1998. It's worth noting that these funds, the 6 million euros of funds, were repatriated to Nigeria, to Nigeria's central bank last year. Probably the most noteworthy case, recent case, involves Gulnara Karimova, the daughter of former President Islam Karimov of Uzbekistan. Karimova was convicted in 2015 of fraud and money laundering associated from a bribery scheme of which she was a central player. She is accused of receiving or soliciting $1 billion US in bribes from telecommunications companies in return for favorable treatment during the award of a mobile phone license in Uzbekistan. It's believed that anywhere between 100 and 300 US million dollars were laundered through funds here in Dublin. At least 100 million euros worth of those funds, or 100 million US dollars of these funds, were managed by Bank of New York Mellon. Those funds were frozen on the request of the US authorities through the Department of Justice here. And as I understand it, they are still sitting in an escrow account pending a decision on when and if they will be repatriated to Uzbekistan. So Ireland is, the report, I should say, examines the ways in which risk is assessed by, amongst others, the Department of Justice, which publishes a national risk assessment looking at the risk of money laundering across various sectors, including banking, technology, the gambling sector, and other legal structures, including funds and special purpose vehicles and entities. You'll see from the chart on the screen that retail banking, money remittance firms, and bureau de change are considered high-risk sectors, but they appear to be high-risk sectors in large for organized crime and for ordinary crime and the laundering of these proceeds. It would appear, given the experience so far to date, particularly those 3 cases we cited, that life insurance policies and funds administration and special purpose vehicles pose a very high risk in comparison to other means of laundering assets. We'll talk about how we'll turn to Colin, Alex, to talk about later, to talk about how this risk has been assessed and what improvements might be made to the assessment of this risk as well. But I just wanted to touch on some of the risks posed by special purpose vehicles, which are established quite legitimately in most cases to protect investors from short-term risks, but also pose a risk of money laundering, given sometimes given the secrecy that sometimes surrounds the establishment of these vehicles, and the fact that in many cases they are not subject to oversight and regulation by the central bank, given the fact that in many cases special purpose vehicles such as Section 1110 companies, these are tax neutral vehicles to allow for investments. Sometimes these are availed of by foreign entities and credit institutions themselves, which are not subject to regulation by the Irish authorities. The additional risk highlighted in the report is posed by the abuse of services provided by trusts and company service providers, company formation agents included, who in the past have been able to set up shell companies on behalf of their clients, sometimes disguising the identity of the real owners of structured finance instruments and funds. More recently, given after 2014, the establishment of shell companies was outlawed, but these shell companies can still be sold on. And it's been noted in the past how company formation agents have established companies that have gone on to be used by organized crime and by corrupt officials to lure the proceeds of their crimes. Also noted, given the two cases we mentioned earlier on, Juthamus and the Abacha case, is the potential risk associated with life insurance. And it's also noted that in some cases, legal persons, corporate entities, are availing of life insurance policies that also pose a risk of money laundering. We note too that while Ireland is not considered to be a home for the world's oligarchs, with the exception of one or two, with the golf course in Clare, the rising house prices and the build to rent sector do offer opportunities for short to medium term investment opportunities that also pose a money laundering risk. We also touch on the potential misuse of luxury and high value goods to launder the proceeds of corruption here, and the role that legal and accountancy professions play in enabling the corrupt to launder their money. The money laundering requires intermediaries, not just company formation agents, but solicitors, barristers, and accountants to facilitate the transactions needed to set up the corporate structures and special purpose vehicles that are required to launder both the proceeds of organized crime and corruption. The report, in addition, looked at the institutional and legal framework here. It notes that Ireland is a signatory to most international instruments, with the exception perhaps of the Council of Europe Civil Law Convention Against Corruption. It is transposing, a number of EU directives aimed at tackling money laundering. It was due to transpose the 6th AML directive, I think, in December of last year. It also has a range of instruments at a domestic level aimed at both regulating financial and non-financial service providers, enabling international cooperation to seize the proceeds of organised crime and corruption, and to freeze these assets, most notably the Proceeds of Crime Act provides for the freezing of the funds or the proceeds of crime and corruption, both with or without a criminal conviction. And our legislation was strengthened on foot of the murder of Veronica Guerin in 1996, which led also to the formation of the Criminal Assets Bureau, whose work is in the media in tackling the proceeds of organised crime. There are a number of policy enforcement institutions, including the Department of Finance, the Department of Justice, and the Central Bank, who play a role in applying civil sanctions and remedies against both financial and what are known as DNFBPs, designated non-financial businesses and professions, which would include lawyers, casinos, and real estate agents, for example. The Property Registration Services Authority would regulate money laundering compliance within the property services sector. And the central bank, as a supervisory body, would regulate compliance with AML obligations by financial service providers. And in addition, the Gardaí play a pivotal role, the central role in criminal enforcement. The Garda National Economic Crime Bureau is the agency dedicated to tackling fraud. The Criminal Assets Bureau, for those of you who aren't familiar with the agency, is an independent, semi-autonomous agency which is made up of numerous bodies, including members of the Gardaí, the Irish Revenue Commissioners of Tax Authorities, and the Department of Social Protection. The report also looks at how these agencies are working together, at both a strategic and enforcement level. The level of coordination and communication amongst them finds there are shortcomings, in particular in terms of strategic coordination, and highlights the need for better coordination at a strategic level to tackle this problem. The report notes that there's a distinction to be drawn between civil and criminal enforcement of our money laundering rules and laws. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. It was already touched on the need for international cooperation as well, but I will turn to Colin, who spent a little time looking at this area in particular. And then we turn to the repatriation of the proceeds of corruption. And I know we have colleagues from overseas who's dedicated much of their careers to seeing that when the money, when the assets, the proceeds of corruption are confiscated, that they return in a responsible way. And numerous agencies and commentators have noted the risk of misuse of those funds once they are repatriated. And we have a legal framework in place that enables the repatriation of these funds, in spite of the fact that states aren't explicitly mentioned as victims in our Proceeds of Crime legislation. Section 3 of the Proceeds of Crime Act does allow for states to essentially apply for victim status and allow them to apply to the state or directly to the High Court for repatriation of those funds. And this has been the case in the Karamova, in the instance of Gonara Karamova, and as we noted earlier, in the case of the repatriation of the funds embezzled and laundered by or on behalf of the family of Sania Bacha. We also look at barriers to repatriation, including some of the political considerations that might need to be weighed up, the legal complexity, perhaps the use of language that sometimes causes confusion amongst different authorities, and the possible solutions to those barriers. And then finally, we turn to recommendations. There are 18 in total, organized under 4 headings. I won't go into all of them, but we focus on the need for better strategic coordination, have called on the government in the past and will continue to do so to consider establishing a centralized, unified body, a national anti-corruption bureau that would tackle serious corruption-related offences, and a unified AML agency that would, in particular, look at regulate designated non-financial businesses and professions. We have been calling for legal reform that would allow for better oversight and enforcement, as well as international cooperation and resourcing of existing agencies, including the Gardaí and the Criminal Assets Bureau, to lead on intelligence-led policing aimed at identifying and freezing the proceeds of these corruption. And after I've spoken to, or we've talked about the report with Colin and Alex, I'll turn to Laure as well to look at what's being done at an EU level, and to talk to us too about best practice in repatriation of the proceeds of corruption, in particular, to examine the role that civil society might play in both participating and monitoring the repatriation of the proceeds of corruption. So I think that's pretty much that for now. Alex, I'll turn to you first and ask you what insights you thought were worth sharing from the report. What recommendations you think we need to be prioritizing? What short-term gains might be explored, and your thoughts more generally on the report and the research you've done.
Yeah, John, thanks very much for that, and thank you all for attending. And I just say apologies in advance. My Wi-Fi is pretty weak out here in the sticks, so if I suddenly freeze in some hideous grimace, that'll be why. Really, I think I just highlight in particular 2 areas that came out of our work on this report, and those would really be around strategy and strategic coordination. And that includes both having a good strategic intelligence picture of the threat from overseas corruption and also enforcement. And within that, we include not only criminal enforcement, but also the regulatory framework as well. So on strategy, and I was glad to see that I think we're broadly aligned with the Hamilton review. That's the review that was recently completed by James Hamilton, aided by a very illustrious review group. As I say, I think we're broadly aligned with that review in the need for a pretty fundamental overhaul or rethink of the strategic framework around tackling, well, in the case of this report, we're looking specifically at overseas corruption, but corruption and wider economic crime in the round. And for that reason, we've recommended that there is a very clear publicly accessible strategy for tackling corruption, within which overseas corruption is given due consideration, so that it's not dominated just by the domestic piece. And also that strategy feeds into a clear action plan with the responsibilities of different stakeholders, different departments and agencies clearly assigned, and potentially coordination and impetus given to that process by the Department of Anti-Shock, so that it doesn't just sit in a drawer and die a slow death within the machinery of government. So that's on the strategic side. But I think, and this is perhaps where something that we've flagged up that we consider really important, that if that strategy and that strategic framework is not guided by a clear understanding of the threat, then you're potentially pointing your whole machinery in the wrong direction. So for that reason, we've recommended that there's a very clear, periodically updated threat assessment. And that's not just an assessment of the risk or the deficiencies in particular sectors in terms of their AML controls, although that's a very important part of it, but also the threat, and this draws on intelligence feeds from whether it's Angada Shiakana or the revenue commissioners and international partners, that we put together a good strategic intelligence picture of the threat from overseas corruption, and that we understand what that can do to social cohesion, to confidence in the Irish financial system, and to public trust in government and the state more widely. So that's on strategy. On enforcement, on the regulatory piece, I think we saw a pretty clear gap between the efforts of the Central Bank of Ireland in their ability, and we're not saying it's perfect, but on their capacity and capability, and indeed their transparency in exercising their supervisory responsibilities around AML controls. They clearly published the details of enforcement activity and the nature of their supervisory framework. And a lot of that is glaringly absent in the case of other AML supervisors, albeit it is getting better. And I think we have to acknowledge that in particular, the Department of Justice has put additional resources into the areas over which it has supervisory responsibility. That notwithstanding, we would still recommend that in the case in particular of designated non-financial professions and businesses, that that whole area requires, and this indeed was a recommendation from the United Nations, that whole area requires a review, and we've recommended the establishment of a single authority. Instead of this patchwork quilt of different bodies, some of them self-regulating, with very different approaches to the enforcement and supervision of AML controls, that there would be one single authority for DNFPBs that would exercise those functions. And then finally, just on the criminal enforcement piece, I think one of the messages from our report is that, broadly speaking, and there are some clear exceptions which we've sought to highlight in the report, Ireland has a fairly good legislative and institutional framework for tackling the proceeds of overseas corruption. And indeed, particularly in the last few years, Ireland's ability to enforce the criminal law against money laundering has improved, in some cases quite dramatically. We have a very capable police service, aided by other partners. And one of the overriding messages from our report is that if Ireland is to keep to its commitments on the international stage, in particular its pledged commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in particular SDG 16, that we really need to see the law enforced proactively on the basis of intelligence, as John mentioned earlier, in relation to overseas corruption cases. They're complex, they're costly, but But thus far, and we may be wrong in this, but going on the information in the public domain, the cases of overseas corruption that have been put before the courts in Ireland have been the result of other countries coming to Ireland. And I think given the sheer scale of the Irish economy, its openness to international finance, John mentioned earlier the 2.8 trillion euros that flows through the Irish financial system. We would really like to see some more proactivity in terms of criminal enforcement of potentially corrupt money flowing through that financial system. So I'll leave it there. Strategy and enforcement are really two areas that I would highlight. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex. As the report notes, the preference to date has been on prevention rather than enforcement, with the central bank and others playing a role in ensuring compliance with regulations. And we note as well that in those three cases where assets have been identified, corrupt assets have been identified, that they have been, that has happened after investigations by, or on foot of investigations by authorities in the US, in Thailand, and in Nigeria. So we noted before that, and we noted beyond this report that the system is reactive, very much reactive in one sense, particularly when it comes to criminal law enforcement, and not just in the AML space, but also in anti-bribery and anti-corruption more generally. Colin, you have dedicated your academic career to this topic. You spent a lot of time looking at legal structures here. I mean, you have, I'm sure, the number of observations and some recommendations you'd like to highlight too. But in terms of our legal framework, is it currently fit for purpose? Are there any additional reforms that you would recommend?
My initial thoughts, John, would be that Ireland does have a very robust legislative framework, but that there might be some issues in how that applies in practice. I'm not one of those people who thinks that in response to a particular event, the first response should be, we need more laws. It might be a case of looking at what we currently have. And yes, there might be tweaks needed in certain instances. So for example, there might be something that we realize now that was not an issue when legislation was being initially drafted. And yes, you do bring in an amendment to deal with that. But in general, I don't think Ireland needs an overhaul of our legislative framework. I think it is pretty strong. We do need to look at specific issues of practice, but generally it is pretty strong.
So one point that we didn't touch on in the report, in large part because it was a more recent development, was the potential use of new investment liability partnerships. As we know, limited liability partnerships have been abused in the UK, abused in particular by organized crime and corrupt officials to launder what was estimated to be about $200 billion US in funds and suspicious transactions at Danske Bank in Estonia. And for some reason, we fast-tracked legislation through here to compete with the UK and other jurisdictions for some of this business. I noted yesterday in dealing with talking to the RBO, the registration of beneficial ownerships or of beneficial ownership that the statutory instrument that would give effect to the beneficial ownership provisions in that legislation had yet to be commenced, so that these funds, these structured finance instruments, are or appear to be wide open to abuse. As you say, Colin, more generally speaking, the system or the legislation more broadly is strong, but we have been slow too in reacting to emerging risks, and indeed to even transposing European Union directives. We were fined by the Commission not too long ago for delays in transposing. I think it was the fourth AML directive. I could be wrong, or it could be the fifth. There's so many of them now that I'm losing track. But we are, I think, delayed in transposing the sixth AML directive. And it's worth noting too that there are so many different agencies with responsibility in departments as well. It's not just the Department of Justice, it's the Department of Finance, Department of Business, Enterprise and Innovation too, that have some responsibility for giving effect to this legislation. I mean, Colin, you also noted that language matters too. We have 2 pages of acronyms, I think, in the report. This is a very dry and technical topic. Have you found, I mean, in your research, that language is posing a barrier, and different legal provisions here and across the European Union are posing a challenge?
Indeed. If I give one example, an academic example, first of all, because in essence, there's really no consequence if we are talking about quokka in academia compared to issues with language in practice at an operational level. So a couple of years ago, I was starting a new book project with a colleague, and we invited someone from Bulgaria to write about civil forfeiture in Bulgaria. And in my mind at the time, civil forfeiture, just what we have in Ireland, the CAB approach to non-conviction based asset confiscation. You can see the difference in terminology there. So this person agreed and submitted a chapter on civil forfeiture, but had focused on post-conviction confiscation, because that's what they termed civil forfeiture there, which is, as we know, very different to Ireland. Yeah. As I say, at the academic level, that doesn't matter. It was a fascinating chapter. It was included in the book, and I really enjoyed learning about post-conviction approaches in Bulgaria. Now put that into the operational setting. If you have someone from Ireland contacting their counterparts in Bulgaria saying, we have a civil forfeiture order and we want this enforced abroad, or they're looking at a joint investigation, terminology matters. And the reason I use this example is it's not a theoretical discussion. This example happened in practice. I know a former law enforcement person in the UK who spent 6 or 7 months working with colleagues in another country, where they were talking about one aspect and someone in another country was talking about something completely different, even though it was the same terminology. So I think it is important at the operational level that people are on the same wavelength.
Yeah, I mean, even amongst anti-corruption practitioners, we talk a lot about asset declarations, asset recovery, but in very many cases, corrupt officials are benefiting not from assets but from liabilities procured through corrupt transactions. So I think the HSBC Mexico case highlighted the risk or the practice of borrowing on the strength of deposits of the proceeds of drug crime, and using that borrowing, and they could be borrowing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars from banks based on the collateral that they've deposited or that they have with the banks to invest in clean businesses. And we talk, I mean, in anti-money laundering discourse, there's a lot of talk, I mean, about layering as a means of or stacking as a means of cleaning money. You don't just deposit the proceeds of crime necessarily into a bank account. That money needs to be moved on into sometimes legitimate investments through companies of which the beneficial owners are not always known, and different financial instruments, as I said, either lending or insurance policies or other structured finance instruments like collateralized debt obligations, other securitized debt instruments are used to hide the money trail. There are some vehicles, investment vehicles here, that are also making it difficult, as I mentioned a moment ago, investment liability partnerships that pose a risk, and Section 1110 companies too. But briefly, Alex, I'll turn back to you again and ask about your views on enforcement capability. We've just established a register of beneficial ownership. I mean, it's not clear that given the multitude of agencies that we have here, that we have the resources, leaving aside coordination, that we have the resources needed to keep track of the flow of dirty money in Ireland.
Yeah, I think there are two issues here in terms of resourcing the enforcement piece. One, in terms of the supervisory bodies, as you mentioned, the CRO and its responsibility to maintain the register of beneficial owners. It's not clear what exactly the enforcement capabilities of the CRO are in relation to the register. It's not clear whether they have the resources, even if they had the capability to enforce it, whether they have the resources to do so. And then in terms of other supervisory authorities, certainly other reviews, whether it's by sort of FATF or the UNCAC review group and review groups assessment of Ireland, they've all pointed to the fact that there's sort of differing understandings of the compliance and enforcement functions of those supervisory bodies, differing understandings of their responsibilities to inform the appropriate authorities. I think, for example, the Law Society have passed a handful of suspicious transaction reports onto to the Gardaí and to the Revenue. Again, some of this, the situation may actually be better than how we perceive it, but that comes down to transparency. Few of these bodies publish details of their enforcement activities, like the central bank do, and again, that reflects on the capability of those professions to regulate themselves in some cases, or to uphold AML controls. In relation to criminal enforcement, I think there's anyone that's worked in law enforcement will know that there is a very clear mandate to go after, and quite rightly, it's a policing and a political imperative to go after organised criminal groups that are impacting upon society and causing most harm. And sometimes the most complex, lengthy, and indeed costly investigations and intelligence gathering operations are those that sort of quietly get put to the side because other imperatives take precedence for all sorts of good reasons. And I think one of the potential one of the recommendations we make in this report is that overseas development assistance could be used to bolster the capabilities of, in particular, the GNECB and its anti-corruption unit, in order to carry out investigations into overseas corruption and the proceeds of that corruption that may be flowing through the Irish financial system or wider economy. And that would be in line, as we see it, in line with the use of ODA and cracking down on the use of the Irish economy for corrupt funds.
Yeah, I mean, it should be noted that more money is flowing out of Africa every year. I think it's estimated about $50 billion dollars as embezzled and is flowing through international financial centers from and into real estate and other assets from the from Africa, and more representing more money than is made available through aid annually. So I think it's important to underscore the link between international development and the need to stop the flow of state assets through Dublin and other international financial centres. Laure, I'll turn to you briefly. I know we have a number of questions here related to EU directives, and a question from Alastair will come off as well about the EU, the 2014 EU directive on illicit assets. Do you want to briefly talk to us about what your thoughts on the response at an EU level to this issue, and what more needs to be done to address these issues amongst member states? I'm particularly interested, given the EU office had done some work on golden visas, to your thoughts on where the gaps need to be plugged here too.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, John. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks. This is a very dense discussion covering both the preventative side and the asset recovery. So I'll try to be concise and zoom out on the at the EU and look at the EU level what's currently in the pipelines, because 2021 is quite a busy year for anti-money laundering and asset recovery. So if we look at both issues, we have two ongoing processes or that are about to start. We, on the money laundering prevention side, we have so there are actually two sub-processes. One is the implementation of the FIFA-AML directive, so the latest one at national level, which has been delayed. It was supposed to be implemented last year. Transposed last year. It's partial for some member state like Ireland, but we're getting there. And I think the recent OpenLux revelations were quite telling about the potential benefits of having public access to beneficial ownership information. It allowed those journalists to actually dig out some cases that involved some criminal activities, potentially criminal activities. But it also revealed a number of loopholes and problems we still have, which are related to the adequacy of the rules. What the journalists identify is that half of the companies were not declaring the beneficial ownership information, and this is because they were misdeclaration or problems with the implementation, but it's also because the rule do allow not to declare if you are below the 25% threshold. And so there's here a loophole in the definition that will need to be improved if we want to have really like meaningful access to meaningful information on beneficial ownership. I saw there are questions on trust. I can touch upon this a bit later, perhaps. And so that's one first problem that would need to be addressed: adequacy of the rules, like really getting into implementation, but also assessing whether the framework when implementing, having a bit of a feedback loop, which would allow to also improve the rules. And in parallel of this implementation process, we have also revision of the rules that are upcoming. It keeps, like, I don't know, AML legislation keeps just evolving as the scandals piles up. So the latest one that the banking scandals, you mentioned the Danske Bank, which was a very good illustration of the problem of coordination of supervision, the lack of the loophole on supervision, and the fact that we've achieved financial integration at the EU level. So capital can move freely across borders, but we haven't got to the same level of integration when it comes to supervision, which is done at national level. And here we see, like, for example, with the Danske Bank, it was a real problem, like exactly this problem of the Danish supervisor not speaking with the Estonian and not taking the right action at the right time. So this is all being discussed. We expect a whole package from the Commission in May. And this for us should include the creation of a separate body for supervision, which would be properly resourced and have proper powers as well of independent investigation and sanction. Of course, not to substitute the national level, just to complement on specific cases that are high risk, cross-border. So there's really need to be a clear articulation with the national level. Then establishment of an EU FIU is also on the table. And in order to get this EU supervision, you need a common baseline. So the idea of the Commission is to propose to turn the directive, which leaves room for interpretation at member state level, into a regulation which would have to be implemented as it is. So that would actually allow for having supervision at EU level. And here we would actually want to push for some improvements of AML rules, and in particular on beneficial ownership transparency rules that I mentioned earlier, having some like revising the definition of beneficial ownership, having some verification mechanism, making sure mandating member states to actually properly verify the data, and having also some improvement on beneficial ownership around trusts. As this is mentioned, this is really relevant for Ireland, common law country. It was a big fight at the time, and we managed to get some stuff there that were quite good, but it's not enough. Like, the transparency is still a bit limited. It's information on beneficial ownership for trust is available if you can demonstrate a legitimate interest, and we all know that this is like a very vague notion that leaves room for interpretation. And then on the other reform route, we have asset recoveries also, where we expect a legislative proposal from the Commission in Q4 of this year, so a bit later. There's currently the framework, like asset recovery is governed by a directive that was adopted in 2014 on asset freezing and confiscation. There is absolutely nothing on the legislation remains blind on the last phase, the restitution phase. So what we would want to see is well, a bit more effectiveness, because despite all these reforms and efforts by the EU, there's really little progress on the ground. I think the latest statistic we have, which is a bit outdated from Europol, shows that only 2% of the estimated proceeds of crime that are held in Europe are frozen, and 1% is confiscated. So it's like really like the over 99% remains in the pockets of criminals. So we need to improve at all phases. On the confiscation front, having some across the EU, having this kind of this instrument that are called confiscation, non-conviction based confiscation, would actually help secure, confiscate the assets, target the assets without having to secure a prior conviction of the individuals, which is should happen very often in a third country, and it's not like makes Europe dependent on a third country that might not have the legislation or the judicial system in place to allow for that. And then it would be important to have also to introduce some principle for responsible restitution of these assets. I won't go into the detail of this principle, but making sure there's like transparency, that the funds that are confiscated are separate from the general budget, are traceable, that civil society is involved in the process of restitution. We have developed 10 principles, which I could go further into detail later on with an NGO coalition. And as Alicia Ilkamov, one of the participants, mentioned, this is a legislation that actually is likely to pass in France, and we would want to see that also happening at EU level. I should actually mention, John, you said you were very interested in golden visas, and I think this is also something going back to money laundering prevention. The legislation that has to do with money laundering prevention. It's important also that some high-risk sectors that have not yet been recognized as high-risk by the EU are, and this includes golden visas. It's been mentioned in the last supranational risk assessment, but it's still doesn't go down until at the legislation level, where players in this industry selling passports or golden passports or visa should actually be subject to AML, anti-money laundering obligation. They should be carrying proper due diligence and enhanced due diligence on what is considered as like very high risk profile applicants. It's clearly won't be enough, but at least that would be a first step. And then the second high-risk sector I want to mention is investment funds, because it has been pointed out by Transparency International as part of its Open Looks revelations. If you take investment funds, just investment funds, it's not like for all companies, it was half that were not declaring their beneficial owners. For investment funds, it's 80%. So the rules are clearly not adequate. Why? Because investment pools in their structure, it's like a pool of investors, and it's very likely that there won't be any end investors being above the 25%. So that's a way to actually circumvent the rules. And these kind of instruments, as highlighted by John, looking at this table, are considered as medium to high risk sectors. It's also the case in Luxembourg. It's just represent a big chunk of the economy, the Luxembourgish economy. So it's important that the rules are also adjusted and adapted for this kind of instruments. And I think I'll stop here. I've been already very long, but I'm happy to respond to any question you may have.
We could go on for a lot longer, Laure, but we need to be conscious of people's time. No, that's excellent. Thanks very much. I know we saw a number of questions come in. I'm not sure from the same attendee who's anonymous here, but I think you've already touched on this, Laure, about the alignment of civil and EU or common law jurisdiction, or the difficulties sometimes in imposing what is largely a civil law solution to common law jurisdiction through the transposition of these directives. I don't know, Colin has a particular view on this as well. But the participant says it raises issues in relation to beneficial ownerships of trusts, and that the trusts are just pension funds, for example, are a high-risk sector in themselves, and there just seems to be a disparity across the EU in the approach to addressing transparency and beneficial ownership requirements in respect of these. I mean, you already touched on the use of companies to buy life insurance policies. And we noted as well that Ireland, or Dublin itself, is a centre for the administration of these investments. I guess we can take that as a comment as much as a question, unless you have anything to add, either Colin or Laure, on that point.
I think Laura has been very comprehensive on this already. Just to add that, yes, there are difficulties with beneficial ownership. We can see how debates on this have gone on for years and years, and there is no easy solution. It might be presented in many documents that, oh, it will be easy just to introduce beneficial requirements, but there are so many practical difficulties. I can see this issue dragging on, and we could be back here in another 5 years and having the very same discussion.
There's a question around distinction between securitization and non-securitization sectors and the risks posed by each of these. We note in the report non-securitization, special purpose vehicles include debt securities and loan instruments, and section 1110 companies. Laura, I want to ask you to comment on this. It's a particular a commercial or a legal structure in Ireland that has been used to help companies reduce their tax burden or avoid tax here, but also have in the past posed a heightened risk of money laundering. Alex, did you have a thought on that in particular? I mean, you have highlighted the role of special purpose vehicles for entities here as a conduit for dirty money.
Well, only just to highlight that a significant number of SPVs fall outside of Schedule 2 of the Criminal Justice Act 2010, and therefore aren't subject to AML controls. And I think that would be, without sort of going into the details of particular vehicles and typologies, I think that would be our main concern, that glaring loophole, if you like, is addressed. Yeah.
Not just the not the only loophole, as we know, but it's a glaring one. One of our participants knows that a regulation, EU regulation, would be very problematic for a country such as Ireland. With the departure of the UK from the EU as well, it means we have less influence within both in the Council and Commission in shaping these any new regulations. But it would need to be, the potential impact of a regulation would need to be considered in a common law jurisdiction. Does TI consider the use of and occurrence of the trade in art as a money laundering channel conduit is worthy of attention? I wouldn't have, I don't know whether the panel agrees, but I wouldn't have thought so, particularly given the size of our financial services sector. You consider that funds to the tune of almost 3 trillion euros are being serviced here. That art is a particular is particularly attractive to money launderers, and maybe ordinary crime, but not for kleptocrats and oligarchs here. I mean, maybe Paris and London or New York, but not. I mean, we don't have major galleries here trading in these high value goods, do we?
So, John, I'm happy to come in on art. And art dealers, antiquity dealers, are now included in the 5th Money Laundering Directive. There was a lot of resistance to inclusion by various interest groups beforehand, and a lot of this has come about as a result of concerns more related to terrorism financing and ISIS and looted antiquities being sold in the likes of New York and London, and that money then being used to finance groups like ISIS. But if you look at art, why might it be attractive to money launderers? For the reasons you've said there, it's a low risk, high reward sector for money launderers. That's one point. And art is very easy to transport. And there's one example from Brazil. a corrupt bank official managed to send a Basquiat painting from Brazil to the US, and he sent it by post, and the customs declaration said there's a painting inside, and this painting is valued at £100. It's a Basquiat that was valued at over £8 million. So it is a sector that has potential to be used for money laundering. The extent to which it is used, we don't know. But I do think we need to take into account, well, if you are adding this new sector and another sector and another sector onto the AML regime, you do have to go back to this issue of resourcing. So if art dealers are to be regulated, well, who is to regulate them? Are they going to be giving more resources to do more work, or are they expected to do more work with the same or even less resources? If you go back to the early 90s and the sectors that were subject to AML then, compare the sectors that are now subject, there are a lot more regulated sectors. Has it kept pace in terms of resourcing of supervisors? I don't think so.
Yeah, and we're expecting a government department as well, in large part, to regulate or monitor compliance of these sectors, of compliance with AML controls in these sectors. There was a question around the risk of money laundering in the aviation leasing sector, which I understand would use special purpose vehicles to a large degree too. Alex, have you a view on this? And I can't say I'm overly familiar with the sector itself, but
no, and similarly, I wouldn't claim any knowledge on that sector, or indeed of any cases that involve that sector. Only just to sort of following on from what you and Colin have said, that both money launderers, professional money launderers, whether they're working on behalf of organised criminal groups or of corrupt individuals from overseas, are known for their entrepreneurialism and their innovation, and they will weigh reward against risk, as Colin mentioned. And if they see a sector that is has very light touch or zero regulation, and they can pass their assets through that with relative ease, they'll jump on it. So I think, further to what Colin said, our response has to be sufficiently nimble that we can, in resourcing terms, as well as the legislative and institutional framework, that we can respond to that. And that's part of the reason why, as you were saying, John, that our understanding of the threat needs to be constantly updated, and then the framework around that to be adapted accordingly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, so noted before, we're more than one step behind the criminals here, and both law institutions move like oil tankers. They're very slow to respond to these threats or identify them in the first place. So I wanted to move on briefly and deal with some of the questions from Alisher. It'll come off, and I should so thank Alisher for the support. Alisher is works with the Open Society Eurasia, Open Society Foundation Eurasia program, which funded the initial research on this project, and has spent a lot of time supporting civil society organizations and research around the Gulnara Karimova case. And Alisher asked whether one needs new laws. The EU 2014 directive on illicit assets lacks any language on asset return. France is currently considering a bill on responsible asset repatriation, given a lack of such policy. And the only Switzerland in Europe has a more or less elaborated policy in this regard. Do you think such a policy should be adopted by Ireland? I should just, for context, note as well that Ireland just recently signed a memorandum of understanding with Nigeria to repatriate $6 million, I think it was $6 million in funds frozen in Dublin, believed to be the proceeds of corruption, of Sonny Abacha's corruption. And this MOU did refer to commitments around transparency, but there were very few specific and clear commitments or requirements included in the MOU. Laure, did you have any particular thoughts on this? So you mentioned the civil society principles. There are the also GFAR principles on asset recovery too, and obligations that we've committed to under the United Nations Convention of Against Corruption. That mean we have to be cognizant of the need to ensure that when this money is frozen and recovered, that it's not repatriated in a way that would allow it to be abused again.
Yeah, no, we're definitely definitely in favor of such legislation being adopted in Ireland, but more generally at EU level, it would be important to have some harmonization and these principles and some principle, because what happens today is, so there is no harmonized practice, and in many countries, since they're in the instance where in cases when a mutual agreement cannot be, or cooperation cannot happen between the EU member state that has confiscated and the country of origin of the assets, then nothing happens and the money is actually transferred to the general budget of the confiscating country. But when we talk about grand corruption cases like Golnara Karimova that you mentioned, where public money has been massively embezzled, then this money belongs, the rightful owners of this money are the citizens of the country of origin. And this money should be restituted to benefit them and not the corrupt leaders that actually embezzled the money in the first place. So we set up this, we developed these 10 principles that would allow for a return, but with some making sure that transparency and accountability are guiding the process from beginning to end. And that include, as you said, I mentioned that a bit earlier, that includes, for example, making sure that the confiscated assets are traceable and kept apart from country's national budget, that independent civil society organizations are able to participate in the process and on both sides. So in the country where the money has been the assets have been confiscated, and in the country where the money should be returned. Then having access to the agreements on the confiscation and repatriation of the assets, like public access, making sure that at least the mechanism through which the money is channeled respect certain number of anti-corruption, rule of law, and accountability. Like there are some safeguards as regard to corruption, rule of law, and accountability. That the money ultimately benefit the people of the country from the country from which they were stolen. So these are I haven't gone into the detail of the 10 principles, and I'm happy to share our latest report on this topic. But these are really like common sense, but important to have them written in legislation, so that every member state can refer to it whenever a restitution case is for any restitution case in the future.
Great. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. No. That's well understood, and we'll make the principles available. They are linked in the report, but we'll also make them more freely available on our website as well. And if anyone wants to learn more about the work that our colleagues in Brussels are doing, they can visit. Your website is transparency.eu. Is that right? It is. Yeah. Yeah. There was a question around the threat that cryptocurrencies are posing. We don't really touch on that in the report. As I said, this is in some respects, the report is a couple of years out of date. We're trying to we're playing catch up ourselves here, and some new developments haven't been captured in this, and particularly with the rise in the value of Bitcoin recently, seen heightened risk that it will be used. Of course, because it's based on blockchain, there are opportunities here. Sometimes been discussed to use blockchain as an anti-money laundering tool too. I don't know if Laure or anyone else, you have a view on this, or whether this has been discussed at an EU level.
Yes, it is. I am afraid I also can't really develop on this, but it's clearly a threat that's being taken into account by the Commission. And there should be actually some new proposals as part of the package that will be announced in May.
Yeah,
to address the specific sector and issue.
Yeah, same attendee, I think, asked, is it ever possible to confiscate these currencies? It is an very interesting question, given only the holder of it would usually have access to the passwords. But I'm sure they can be. I mean, you can be required to hand those over, but it makes life a little more difficult because you don't necessarily have a central authority managing these currencies the way you do a central bank or a retail bank, which is subject to government or regulatory oversight. No, like we say, there will be new emerging threats and risks that we need to keep our eye on, and our policy responses will have to adjust. And I think in the case of cryptocurrencies, we'll also need to look at using new technologies like blockchain and even artificial intelligence to help us deal with these threats. Clear, I mean, given the scale of the problem, and the FinCEN files case last year showed how ill-equipped even the best resourced agencies are to monitor suspicious activity or transaction reports. And the Gardaí receive, the Revenue Commissioners, more than 20,000 of these reports annually. They're ill-equipped here to deal with them, and I think it might be worth looking at how we can employ technology to monitor these suspicious transactions too. I don't know if anyone else has anything. Sorry, Alex.
Well, just to, oh, Laura, go ahead.
No, sorry. I just wanted to mention something that I think one of the loopholes in the current directive is that you've got a checkpoint when you convert money from fiat to virtual or virtual to fiat. But then if it's virtual currency to virtual currency, there's no need for just conducting due diligence. So you could actually have a bit of a risk here, where you use those channels until it just looks clean, and then you can actually convert it back to fiat. And you don't need to check the whole chain. So I know there is a loophole here that we need to be addressed.
Yeah, Alex.
Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, no, it was just to say that obviously the tech sector is one of Ireland's large and growing sectors, and within that there's the whole cryptocurrency industry. And just coming back to strategy and communication, I think one of the things that we would really push for as a result of this report is greater dialogue between the elements of the state that are involved in the anti-money laundering framework and those industries that are most susceptible to the laundering of criminal or corrupt proceeds from overseas. And within that, the tech sector and the whole domain of cryptocurrencies has to be one important stakeholder within that.
Yeah, No, thanks, Alex. I'll take that as your final comment, unless you have anything else to add. I was going to turn to Colin and Laure as well for their final thoughts before we wrap up. I don't see any more questions coming in. We've 3 minutes left. Colin, did you have any final thoughts?
Two very quick points. One is the one of resourcing, which we have emphasized throughout the session today, so I don't dwell on that. And the second one is to simply echo Alex's point just there about this dialogue. I've recently finished a project with colleagues here in the UK on the property market, and we interviewed estate agents and compliance officials. And at the start of this project, my hypothesis was that there would be a lot of resistance to AML on the part of estate agents. And actually it was the opposite. There was a lot of willingness to be involved, and their complaints focused on practical barriers that AML caused for them, one of which was the interaction and engagement, or what they described as a lack of support from regulators. So for example, picking up the telephone to the helpline, asking for help and not really receiving any help. So I do think there's a lot of potential for improving this dialogue.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Laure, did you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I should just stay and talk for myself. We tend to be obsessed with like further improving the rules, especially at EU level. And I think this kind of seminars or just having this feedback looks like the open looks is very useful to see how it's implemented, what's working, what's not, and also putting some efforts into implementation and making it effective. Because yeah, the rules could always be better, but I think it's when the rubber hit the road that we really see the effect. So that's this is part of it, all this discussion we're having today, but also looking at what's going on at national level and having some feedback on how it's working is very useful. Thanks a lot. Thanks to everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Laure. And Alex, did you have any final thoughts? Well, you've already shared them. So I just on that, I'd like to thank everyone for participating. Alex, Colin, Laure, everyone who joined us as attendees. Alisher and Open Society Foundation Eurasia Programme for support. Our colleagues as well at TIU in Brussels who've become a centre of excellence on this topic, and my colleagues at TI Ireland for their support too, and patience as I spent so much time on this recently. We'll just conclude by saying that the stakes are too high for us not to address this problem, and those most tractable of the world's problems will not be addressed for as long as senior public officials and office holders are incentivized to invest in parts of their economy that allow them to embezzle state assets and the proceeds of crime, and as long as financial centres like Dublin are used as conduits for that dirty money, we'll not get to grips with some of the world's biggest challenges, including climate change and global poverty. So on that, I hope to see you again at some stage in the future. As I said, this is a work in progress. We'll continue if we can to update this report and to monitor Ireland's performance in addressing illicit financial flows, and look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, if you want to visit our website, transparency.ie, where the report is available, please do so. And don't be afraid either to send us your comments and further questions. With that, thanks again, and look forward to seeing you again anon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, John. Bye-bye.